In a kitchen in California, in the early weeks of 1981, a telephone rang. It was the kind of phone that sat on the counter near the window, avocado green, its cord coiled in loose spirals on the linoleum, and whoever picked it up that afternoon would have heard on the other end a voice they knew, a neighbor maybe, a friend from the church social, or someone from the office, and the voice would have said something like, "This happened to someone my friend knows." The afternoon light would have been coming in at a shallow winter angle, falling across the counter, and whoever was standing there would have shifted their weight on the linoleum floor and listened as the story began. The story was about a dog. More specifically, it was about a Doberman pinscher, a large and alert breed with a particular reputation for watchful loyalty, and it was about what happened when that dog was found in distress in a quiet suburban house in a neighborhood very much like this one. The voice on the telephone would have said it carefully, because the story had a shape, and the shape mattered. It was a story that needed to be told in a certain order for it to arrive correctly, and whoever was standing in that California kitchen, shifting their weight on the linoleum, would have listened to the whole thing, and then, before the week was out, would almost certainly have called someone else to tell it. That is how the choking Doberman entered the world, or at least how it entered the documented record. The earliest traceable versions of the story appear in early 1981, surfacing in California, in Arizona, and in several Midwestern states within weeks of one another, with no clear single point of origin identified by anyone who has looked carefully at the record, whether one telling seeded all the others, or whether multiple independent versions grew from the same general cultural soil and simply resembled each other the way related plants resemble each other, is a question the evidence has never quite resolved. What the record does show is that by the time anyone thought to write it down, the story was already moving. It moved through workplaces. It moved through hair salons, where people sat in chairs for long enough to hear something through to the end, and were relaxed enough to pass it along when they left. It moved through churches, through the conversations that happened in parking lots after Sunday services while children ran between the cars. It moved through social gatherings of the particular kind that early 1980s suburban life produced in reliable abundance. Dinner parties, block parties, neighborhood watch meetings, the informal back porch conversations that a warm evening could extend for hours. In each of these places, the story arrived as something that had happened to a friend of someone present, or a friend of that friend, or someone connected through a workplace or a school, always one or two steps removed, always just close enough to feel credible. The telephone was the engine of its wider distribution, and in the early months of 1981, a suburban telephone network was a surprisingly powerful transmission mechanism for a story with the right properties. A single well-connected person in a middle-sized American city could over the course of a week reach dozens of people directly and several hundred indirectly through the chains she set in motion. The choking Doberman had the right properties. It was specific enough to feel real. The breed of dog, the suburban setting, the veterinary emergency, all had the texture of things that actually happened to real people. It was structured in a way that rewarded retelling because it had a clear arc with a satisfying, if unsettling, payoff. And it addressed something that people in early 1980s American suburbs were genuinely thinking about, a low-level hum of domestic anxiety that made a story like this one feel relevant in a way that made people want to pass it along. By the end of 1981, versions of the story had been heard in states that had no geographic connection to the original California and Arizona sightings. By 1982, it had spread into Canada, and within a few years of its American emergence, it had crossed the Atlantic entirely. The British versions arrived with adjusted details, the way a story tends to pick up local clothing when it moves into a new place. In some British tellings, the Doberman became a Rottweiler, a breed with a comparably weighty reputation, but a slightly stronger association with British suburban guard dog culture in that period. In others, it became an Alsatian, which is the British common name for a German Shepherd, a breed with a long and specific history in British public consciousness, connected to police work and wartime service. The house in the story shifted too. Instead of the open-plan suburban American home with its attached garage and wide front lawn, the British version settled into semi-detached houses on quiet residential streets, the particular architectural form of post-war British suburban expansion, two houses sharing one wall, a small front garden behind a low gate, a neighbor close enough to hear through the partition if something went wrong. The story fit itself into these houses as though it had always lived there. The garden gate latched. Someone inside was telling it over tea. Australia received a version. South Africa received a version. In each place, the essential architecture of the story remained intact while the surface details shifted just enough to make it feel indigenous, a local suburb, a recognizable breed, a setting that felt like somewhere the listener had driven past. The story was doing what effective stories do when they travel, making themselves at home. All of this movement, all of these regional variations and transatlantic adaptations, might have remained entirely undocumented had it not been for a folklore professor at the University of Utah named Jan Harold Brunvand, who had spent the better part of 2 decades developing a particular area of expertise. Brunvand was interested in what he called urban legends, contemporary stories told as true, circulating through informal oral channels, typically attributed to a friend of a friend rather than to a named primary source, and containing elements of the plausible and the sensational, braided together in proportions that made them simultaneously believable and retellable. He had already published a book on the subject, The Vanishing Hitchhiker, in 1981, which had brought the study of these stories to a wider audience than academic folklore journals typically reached, and he had established himself as the kind of scholar who was genuinely interested in collecting variants rather than simply cataloging them. After the publication of The Vanishing Hitchhiker Brunvand began receiving letters, handwritten letters, arriving at his University of Utah office in quantities that spoke to a readership that had recognized its own experience in his descriptions and wanted to contribute. People wrote to him from across the country describing stories they had heard, stories their neighbors had told, stories that had been circulating in their workplaces or their churches or their children's schools. And among the stories that arrived in his correspondence with notable frequency, arriving in versions from California and Arizona and the Midwest and eventually from across the Atlantic, was the story of the Doberman pinscher found choking in a quiet suburban house. The image of that correspondence, Brunvand, at a desk in Salt Lake City, perhaps near a window with a view of the Wasatch Range in the middle distance, sorting through a stack of envelopes, each containing someone's careful handwritten account of a story they had heard, is in some ways the founding image of the legend's documented history. Each letter in that stack represented a node in the network through which the story had traveled. Each letter had its own return address, its own local flavor, its own small adjustments to the core narrative. A story about a dog in California had traveled through telephone networks and church parking lots and hair salon conversations and dinner party retellings until it arrived, in handwritten form, on the desk of a man in Utah who was professionally equipped to recognize what he was looking at. Brunvand featured the story as the title entry in his 1984 book, Asterisk the Choking Doberman, and Other New Urban Legends, Asterisk. The book collected dozens of regional variants of the story, alongside other contemporary legends Brunvand and his correspondents had documented, but the Doberman story was prominent enough and characteristic enough of its era to give the collection its name. In the book, Brunvand applied to the choking Doberman the full methodological toolkit he had developed over years of fieldwork, tracking variants, identifying stable and variable elements, noting the consistent attribution patterns, analyzing the social and emotional functions the story seemed to serve in the communities that were telling it. The book treated the legend with the same affectionate, careful, scholarly attention that a naturalist might bring to a species recently identified but clearly long established in its habitat. The shelf in the university library where Brunvand's books stood together was a particular kind of record. Asterisk, The Vanishing Hitchhiker. Asterisk, beside asterisk, The Choking Doberman, asterisk, their spines worn in the way that volumes on reserve wear, the repeated handling of students and researchers, making its own kind of testimony to the material's durability. These were books that got used. The stories in them got cited. Graduate students in folklore programs encountered the choking Doberman as a primary case study in the mechanics of contemporary legend transmission, which meant that the story itself acquired an academic afterlife quite separate from its oral one, circulating in seminar rooms and dissertations and methodological footnotes for decades after its suburban moment had passed. The fact that Brunvand gave the story a name, that it became the choking Doberman rather than simply a story someone had heard about a dog, is not a small thing. Naming a legend is part of the process by which it becomes a studied object rather than simply a thing that happens in the world. Once the story had a title and a place in an indexed book, it could be cross-referenced, compared to other stories, traced across time and geography, with the tools that scholarship provides. It moved from being something that lived only in the memories and conversations of the people who had heard it, to being something that could be examined at a remove, the way a pressed flower can be examined long after the plant is gone. What Brunvand found, as he worked through his correspondence and assembled his variants, was that the choking Doberman was not an isolated piece of American suburban weirdness. It belonged to something older and wider. Folklorists had been observing for years that stories with certain structural properties kept appearing in human cultures across long stretches of time and great geographic distances, not identical stories, but stories with the same essential architecture. The specific family that the choking Doberman belonged to had been given several names by researchers working in different traditions, but the most useful labels grouped it under the heading of what some scholars called the endangered friend legend cluster, or alternatively, the helpful animal cluster, a category that gathered together tales in which an animal companion, loyal, present, sometimes initially misunderstood, inadvertently warns its owner of danger that neither the animal nor the owner could have communicated directly. The stories in this cluster are old. Some of them are very old indeed. There is a Welsh legend, widely recorded from at least the 13th century onward, about a hound named Gellert, whose master returns to find the dog bloodied beside an apparently empty cradle, and kills the animal in a fury of grief, only to discover that the hound had killed a wolf that had entered the tent to harm the child. The story is painful, and the emotional logic is very different from the choking Doberman. The animal dies in Gellert's case, a consequence that the American legend carefully avoids, but the underlying architecture is recognizable. An animal has done something that looks at first encounter like damage. Investigation reveals that the animal's action was defensive. The danger was real, and the animal stood between its owner and that danger before its owner knew the danger existed. This pattern was old enough and widespread enough that finding it in a 1981 California telephone conversation was less a discovery than a confirmation. The story was new in its surface details: the Doberman, the suburb, the veterinary emergency, the police call. But in its deep structure, it was participating in something that storytelling traditions across the world had been doing for centuries. A loyal animal, an unseen threat, a misread signal, a revelation. The choking Doberman was a very modern piece of hardware running very old software, and part of what made it recognizable to so many people in so many places was that its emotional logic had been practiced and refined across a great many generations before anyone in early 1980s California picked up an avocado green telephone and began to tell it. Brunvand was careful about what he claimed for this kinship. He did not argue that the 1981 story was a direct descendant of Welsh legend or of any specific earlier tale. The transmission mechanism for that kind of argument would require evidence that no one could produce. What he noted instead was that the structural resemblance placed the choking Doberman within a recognizable tradition, which helped explain why the story found such easy purchase in the communities through which it moved. When people heard it, something in the story felt earned, felt right, felt like a kind of narrative it was natural to believe. That feeling was not accidental. It had behind it a very long history of similarly structured stories being found satisfying and being retold. The regional variants that Brunvand collected reveal the specific ways in which tellers adjusted the story to fit their local circumstances without disturbing its essential form. The breed of dog changed in some regions. Not every area of the country had the same familiarity with Dobermans, and in some tellings, the dog became a large mixed breed or simply was described by size rather than by name. The urban or suburban setting was consistent across nearly all versions, though the specific neighborhood type shifted to match local geography: a cul-de-sac in one version, a tree-lined older suburb in another, a newer development with wide streets and young landscaping in a third. The details of the veterinary encounter varied in their specificity. Some versions named the veterinary practice, or placed it on a particular kind of road, or described the waiting room in ways that grounded the scene in a recognizable local geography. The count of fingers was one of the more variable elements across Brunvand's documented variants. Some tellings described a single finger as the obstruction, others described two. In some of the more dramatic versions, 3 fingers were found. The variation is structurally interesting because the emotional effect of the discovery seems, in practice, not to depend strongly on the count. The revelation lands the same way, whether the number is 1 or 3, which suggests that tellers were genuinely uncertain about what they had heard, rather than deliberately modifying a fixed detail. When people transmit stories orally, numbers are among the elements most prone to drift, because they are specific enough to be memorable in principle, but abstract enough that the mind substitutes neighboring values without registering the change. The geographical spread of the story also reveals something about the infrastructure of oral transmission in the pre-internet era. The story moved fastest along the kinds of social networks that characterized middle-class suburban American life in the early 1980s. Church congregations, parent-teacher organizations, neighborhood associations, workplace social groups. These networks had particular properties that made them efficient carriers of a story like this one. They were composed of people who trusted each other enough to treat a second-hand account as worth repeating. They met regularly in contexts that included open conversational time. They were geographically distributed across the same kinds of neighborhoods where the story was set, which meant that the story always felt proximate. This could be here. This could have happened to someone we know. The transatlantic spread happened through a somewhat different mechanism. International travel by middle-class Americans was increasing through the early 1980s, and the story likely crossed the Atlantic through business travel and personal visits rather than through any coordinated transmission. A traveler arrives in London and over dinner tells a story they heard at home. The British host finds it plausible, finds it interesting, finds it worth repeating. A week later, it is being told at a dinner party in a semi-detached house in a Surrey suburb. The details already beginning to adjust themselves to local geography. The Doberman may remain because the breed had a strong British presence through its association with security work, or it may become an Alsatian or a Rottweiler within one or two retellings. The latched garden gate replaces the American front lawn. The tea replaces the coffee. The story finds its new clothes and continues its journey. What is perhaps most striking about the choking Doberman's documented spread is how little distortion the essential narrative underwent across all of these regional and international iterations. The surface details were flexible. The deep structure was not. In every version that Brunvand and subsequent researchers documented across California and Arizona and the Midwest, across Canada and the United Kingdom and Australia and South Africa, the basic sequence of events was preserved with a consistency that would be remarkable if you did not know that effective stories protect their own architecture. The elements that made the story what it was did not vary, because they were the story. The elements that could vary without consequence varied freely. This kind of structural stability is one of the things that folklorists find most useful for analysis, because it allows the separation of the story's core from its local clothing. The choking Doberman, stripped of its particular details, is a story about a woman alone in a house, an animal that acts as an involuntary alarm, a domestic space that turns out to be less secure than its appearance suggested, and a set of professional authorities, veterinarian, police, who restore order from outside. These elements were present in every version. Everything else was negotiable. The academic life of the story continued well beyond Brunvand's 1984 collection. Later researchers cited it in work on contemporary legend transmission, on the social psychology of rumor, on the specific mechanics of faux attribution, the friend of a friend, sourcing that gave urban legends their characteristic quality of being impossible to trace to a primary witness. Graduate seminars on folklore methodology used it as a case study for variant analysis. Researchers working on gender and domestic anxiety in late 20th century American culture found in it a richly representative example of the kind of narrative that suburbia produced about itself during a particular period of social history. The story never went away entirely, though its mode of transmission changed considerably as the internet expanded through the 1990s and became the dominant medium for informal information exchange by the early 2000s. A story that had traveled in 1981 through telephone calls and parking lot conversations began traveling in the 1990s through email chains, and in the 2000s through message board posts and social media shares, and in the 2010 through the comment threads of social platforms, where someone would post it as a thing that had happened to a friend, and others would respond, some recognizing it, some encountering it for the first time. The faux attribution survived the transition to digital media intact. The story still arrived as something that had happened to someone connected, however loosely, to the person sharing it. Only the medium had changed. Through all of this, the essential connection to those older tales, Gellert and the Welsh Prince, and the dozens of similar helpful animal stories that researchers had documented across European and Asian and African storytelling traditions, remained the most quietly interesting thing about the choking Doberman's history. It was a story that had specific, traceable, modern origins. Early 1981, somewhere in California or Arizona or the Midwest, an unknown first teller with an avocado green telephone and a neighbor who was home that afternoon and picked up on the second ring. But it was also a story that arrived already equipped with the deep structural legitimacy of a narrative type that human cultures had been finding useful for a very long time. Brunvan's library shelf, with its worn spines and its accumulated decades of patient story collecting, was the physical record of that recognition, the moment when the study of folklore grew precise enough and careful enough to see what was happening when a story like this one moved through the world. Not a random rumor, not a simple panic, but a story that was doing what stories in its particular family had always done, identifying a fear, giving it a shape, running it through the ritual of animal loyalty, and discovered danger and institutional response, and releasing it on the other side into something that felt, if not resolved, then at least survived. Stories in this family did not arise because people were irrational. They arose because people were human and had found over centuries of practice that certain narrative shapes carried certain anxieties more safely than direct statement could. The choking Doberman entered that old company in 1981, wearing its specific modern details: the suburb, the Doberman, the avocado green telephone world of early Reagan America. And over the years that followed, it took its place on the shelf beside Gellert and the other old protective animal tales, all of them gathered quietly together in the slow accumulation of a tradition that had never stopped growing. Old company, patient company, the kind of company that does not demand urgency, that simply continues alongside the ordinary world, tellers finding tellers, stories finding stories, the long shelf extending through centuries of small domestic fears, carefully shaped into something that could be carried and passed along and set down again to rest. A key turns in a lock. The sound is small and ordinary, the specific metallic click of a front door yielding to a familiar hand on a Tuesday evening in the early 1980s, somewhere in a suburb whose name changes depending on who is telling the story. The porch light is on, the street behind is quiet, and the door swings inward onto a hallway that looks exactly as it should, except for one thing that is missing from it. The dog has not come. In the versions of this story that folklorists collected and compared and annotated over the years following its emergence, that absent greeting is nearly always the first sign that something has gone wrong. Not a noise, not a sight. The absence of a sound that should have been there, the click of paws on linoleum, the low, excited sound a dog makes when it hears a key it recognizes, and the particular quality of attention a person pays to a room once they have noticed that the expected thing has not happened. The hallway looks normal. The coat rack holds its coats. The table holds its mail. But the dog is not at the door, and the woman who has just stepped inside knows her dog, and this is not how her dog behaves. She finds him in another room, the kitchen, in most versions, sometimes the living room. The precise room shifts across variants, but the dog's condition does not shift very much at all. He is on the floor, and he is in distress, and the nature of that distress is immediately clear even to someone who has never seen a dog choke before. He is pawing at his face. His neck is extended at an angle that is not a resting angle. He is making a sound, or he is trying to make a sound, and it is the trying rather than the sound itself that communicates the urgency of what is happening. The distress the dog exhibits in the legend is worth pausing over because it is one of the elements the story gets most consistently right in a behavioral sense. A dog experiencing genuine airway compromise does precisely this. The front paws come up toward the muzzle, an instinctive and entirely useless gesture, since the dog cannot reach its own pharynx, but one that the body produces anyway in its attempt to solve the problem of not enough air. The neck extends, the mouth opens wider than it normally would. The gum color, which an owner would not necessarily think to check in a moment of panic, might shift toward a pale or bluish cast in severe cases. The dog's eyes carry a quality that owners who have witnessed this uniformly describe as wrong, not in a way they can always articulate, but in a way they recognize immediately as different from ordinary animal expression. This is the first structural hinge of the legend. The owner sees something she can read, not something ambiguous, not something she might dismiss as the dog being unwell in a minor way. She sees an animal in clear and urgent distress, and she responds to it in the way that response makes narrative sense. She takes the dog to a veterinarian. The drive to the clinic occupies almost no space in the story, as it is typically told. It is not a scene the legend lingers over. What the teller wants is to get the dog and the woman to the place that will become the story's center of gravity, and the logistics of getting there. The leash, the car, the address, the after-hours emergency number compress into a single sentence or disappear entirely. This is the kind of narrative efficiency that characterizes oral storytelling in general, and urban legend in particular. The story knows what it is about, and it moves toward that thing without side trips. The veterinary clinic in the choking Doberman legend has a quality that is worth noticing. It is neither prominent nor described in any detail. It is a functional space, rather than a vivid one, a place the story passes through on its way to what the place contains. In the telling, it tends to acquire only enough features to establish that it is a proper medical setting, a waiting area, a front desk, a door through which the dog is taken. Sometimes there is a technician who receives the animal. Sometimes the woman speaks directly to the veterinarian. The details that would anchor the setting in a specific real location, the name of the clinic, the name of the doctor, the cross street, are almost never present. This vagueness is not an accident. The absent specifics are part of what allows the story to travel, to transplant itself from California to Ohio to South Africa without friction, carrying only the structure and leaving the local color to be filled in by whoever is telling it. The woman is now in the waiting room. This is the second structural hinge, and it is where the legend's emotional architecture becomes most deliberate. The woman is seated in a space she knows is ordinary: plastic chairs, a counter with pamphlets about heartworm prevention, perhaps a low television showing nothing important. She is waiting. She does not know how long it will take. She is presumably tired and worried and present in the particular way that a person is present when a creature they love is in trouble somewhere they cannot follow. The story puts her here, in this suspended, incomplete state, while what happens behind the closed door builds toward a finding that will arrive not through her senses, but through a telephone receiver. The veterinarian, working in the examination room, finds what he finds. The story presents this discovery with almost no elaboration of the process. There is no extended scene of the veterinarian working through a differential, no imaging, no long consideration of alternatives. The legend moves directly from the problem to the finding, because what the finding is matters far more to the story than how the finding was reached. And the finding across dozens of collected variants is consistent in its essential form, even when it varies in its specifics. In the dog's throat, sometimes specifically in its mouth, sometimes described as wedged at the back of the palate, sometimes already partway down, there is human material. The most common version settles on 3 fingers, though 2 and 1 also appear in the record, and occasional outlier tellings produce the unsettling image of an entire hand, which Brunvand and his colleagues noted as likely a secondary amplification of the base story rather than a distinct regional variant. 3 has a certain narrative completeness to it. 2 feels understated. 1 paradoxically feels more clinical and therefore in some versions more credible. The number shifts because no number is the true number. There is no version with a verified count, only the range across which the story spreads. The fingers are, in the story's internal logic, the reason the dog is choking. They are lodged in a way that has partially or fully compromised the animal's airway. They are, by definition, no longer attached to anyone. They belong to a person who is not present, who has not been brought in, whose existence the veterinary staff has just inferred from physical evidence with considerable certainty and considerable urgency. What the veterinarian does next is placed in the legend with great consistency. He does not, in almost any version, go first to the waiting room and tell the woman what he has found. He calls the police. This choice, which Brunvand flagged as one of the legend's most interesting structural decisions, tells the listener several things at once. It tells them that the veterinarian understands immediately what the finding implies, that a person was bitten, and bitten seriously, and that person is likely somewhere knowable and still in danger of dying, if not found. It tells them that the situation has moved beyond veterinary jurisdiction into law enforcement territory, with a speed that precludes a polite sequential informing of the client in the waiting room. And it tells them, through dramatic irony, that the woman who brought the dog in is still sitting in that ordinary room with its pamphlets and its low television, not yet knowing that the home she left to come here has become a crime scene. The call to police is the legend's third structural hinge. It is the moment at which the private domestic story becomes an official one, the moment at which the story's concern with home invasion, which has been present from the beginning as subtext, announces itself openly. The dog is still being treated, the woman is still waiting, the police are on their way to her house. Officers arriving at the address in the legend's final movement find the home as the woman left it, at least on its surface. The lights may still be on or off, the doors presumably locked again, or perhaps simply closed. What they find inside, however, is that the home is not unoccupied. The intruder is in a closet. This, too, is one of the legend's consistent elements, though the precise hiding place varies, under a bed in a notable subset of versions, behind furniture in a few, but most often in a closet, which is a space that carries a particular narrative weight in the cultural landscape of the American suburban home. A closet is interior, it is enclosed, it is a space that exists inside the private space, a concealed volume within the already private volume of the house. Finding someone in a closet is not the same narratively as finding someone in a garage or a basement, though those locations appear in variant versions. The closet is closer, more personal, more troubling in proportion to its smallness. The intruder is alive. This, too, is consistent across versions, and it is one of the details that gives the story its particular shape. Dead intruders are resolved problems. Living intruders, Incapacitated, having lost significant blood, having been hiding for some hours in an enclosed space, are still a situation, and it is the situationness of the ending that gives the legend its satisfying closure through authority. The police have arrived. The law enforcement apparatus, which was set in motion by a phone call from a veterinarian, has produced the apprehension of a man who is alive and injured and now in custody. The dog is at the veterinary clinic. The woman is still in the waiting room. All the parts have been accounted for. The narrative loop, as Brunvand observed, closes through a very specific combination of three domains: animal medicine and law enforcement, the domestic and the institutional, the private home and the official response to it. The dog acts first in the private realm. The veterinarian translates that action into official currency by involving the police. The police resolve the situation in the institutional realm. And the woman, who initiated all of this by bringing the dog in, is held at the edge of events throughout, waiting in a room that is between the home she left and the resolution she does not yet know has occurred. This is worth sitting with because it is not accidental. The story has been arranged so that the person most centrally concerned with the events is the last to know about them. She does not witness the discovery. She does not call the police. She is not present for the search of her home. She is in a waiting room under fluorescent light while institutions act on her behalf. This structural choice does a great deal of emotional work in a very small space, and it does so without any of it needing to be stated explicitly. The legend's attention to the intruder as a character is minimal. He is almost entirely defined by what the dog did to him, by the missing fingers, by the incapacitation that kept him in the house, by the blood loss that rendered him unable to flee. He has no motive that the story specifies. He has no name, no appearance, no history. He exists in the legend almost entirely as a plot function, the thing that explains the fingers, the thing that police find, the thing that closes the loop. In some versions, the number of missing fingers on the intruder's hand corresponds precisely to the number of fingers found in the dog's throat, which is the kind of tidy accounting that stories tend toward, and which real events rarely provide. The question of why the intruder stayed is one that Brunvand returned to more than once, and it surfaces repeatedly in his notes on the logic of the legend. A person who had just had one or more fingers bitten off in a house would be in severe pain. Severe pain at a specific location, a dog bite that's severe, would typically produce noise and flight and a prioritization of escape over concealment. The dog, moreover, was still in the house when the intruder presumably retreated to the closet, since the dog was choking on the retrieved material and had not already been removed. A dog that had just bitten an intruder hard enough to sever bone would not typically then settle quietly into a corner and begin quietly asphyxiating, while the injured intruder recovered quietly in a closet 3 rooms away. The two conditions, the dog in distress, the intruder hiding without apparent noise or flight, are difficult to reconcile with what either a dog or an injured human being would actually do in the moments immediately following that kind of confrontation. This does not trouble the story. The story is not interested in those moments. It picks up after the confrontation has already happened, in a moment where its aftermath is readable in the dog's condition, and it moves forward from there with confident momentum. What it leaves behind, in the gap between the bite and the woman's arrival home, is an ellipsis, a compressed and unnarrated time during which the intruder made a series of decisions that the story declines to examine. That gap is where the legend is most clearly a legend rather than a report. The same gap contains a second logical difficulty, which folklorists also noted, though it was raised less frequently then the question of the intruder's immobility. A dog in real respiratory distress would be producing sounds, not necessarily barking, since the obstruction would compromise vocalization too, but the physical sounds of an animal struggling to breathe, the wheeze, the cough, the repetitive pawing on the floor, are not sounds that happen in silence. They happen in a house. The house is in a neighborhood. Neighbors in early 1980s suburban America lived close enough to each other that unusual sounds, sustained over a period of hours, tended to be noticed. The legend does not address whether anyone noticed. No neighbor appears in it. The house is sealed and silent until the woman's key opens the front door, and nothing about the sealed silence is offered as remarkable. Brunvan collected these observations not as debunking, which is a different exercise, but as structural analysis. He was interested in what a story's logical gaps reveal about what the story is actually doing, what work the implausibilities are performing, what they allow, what they protect against. A story that closed its own gaps would be a different kind of story. The choking Doberman, with its ellipses and its offstage confrontation and its incapacitated intruder sitting quietly in a closet, achieves a specific effect that depends on those gaps remaining closed. The listener's attention is directed toward the revelation, the phone call, the police, the resolution. What happened in the house before the woman came home is not the story. The story is what happens after. The legal pad on which Brunvan worked through these observations, the physical image of it, wherever it actually existed, would have accumulated a set of circled questions, each one pointing at a place where the story had smoothed over something rather than resolved it. The intruder's stillness, the dog's audible distress that no neighbor apparently heard, the clean severance implied by the count of separated fingers, the veterinarian's immediate certainty about what the material was and what it meant. Each of these is a place where the story's surface is tight, where the narrative has made a decision to keep moving rather than to account for the mechanics of what it claims. And that tightness is not a flaw the legend fails to notice. It is the shape the legend has taken because of what it needs to do. Stories that must travel, that must be passed along at kitchen tables and in the break rooms of workplaces, that must survive the telephone relay from one neighborhood to the next without losing their force, cannot carry the weight of full forensic accounting. They carry what is necessary and leave the rest in the gap. The choking Doberman carries the dog, the fingers, the waiting room, the phone call, the closet, and the police. Everything else, the noise, the blood, the interval, the flight instinct, the neighbor who somehow heard nothing, everything else falls into the ellipsis and stays there. The veterinary examination in the legend is also, from a procedural standpoint, dramatically simplified. In the story as told, the discovery of the fingers reads as immediate and direct. The veterinarian finds them, and the finding is legible at once. There is no sedation described, no imaging requested, no methodical examination of the dog's airway with instruments. There is no notation in the legend that the veterinarian might at first have thought the obstruction was a large bone fragment, or a piece of toy, or any of the common foreign bodies that dogs produce in clinical practice. The identity of the material human is apparently clear on sight or touch, which is a simplification that the story requires, but which would represent an unusually immediate reading of unusual evidence. Real emergency veterinary practice, presented with a choking large dog, would begin with whatever is most urgent, stabilizing the airway, assessing oxygenation, deciding whether sedation is necessary to examine the obstruction safely. What the veterinarian finds, and when they find it, and what the examination reveals incrementally would unfold according to a clinical sequence that the legend has no use for. The story needs the finding to be a revelation delivered at a moment rather than a gradual diagnostic process, and so the examination compresses, the discovery arrives whole, and the phone call to police follows without the narrative pausing to account for the steps between. This compression is common to urban legends, and it is worth recognizing as a technique rather than a failing. The legend is not trying to describe a veterinary examination. It is using the veterinary examination as a setting for a discovery, and the discovery is what the legend is about. The clinical space is there to make the finding credible, to place it in institutional professional hands, to give it the authority of expertise, but the clinical process itself is a mechanism the story borrows without fully engaging. The same is true of the police response. Officers in the legend arrive, search, find the intruder, and the story ends. There is no warrant, no crime scene preservation, no question of evidence handling, no accounting of the blood the intruder would have been leaving throughout the enclosed space of a closet for however many hours he had been concealed there. The institutional machinery appears, confirms the story's climactic finding, and the narrative closes. What happens next? The ambulance, the hospital, the forensic examination of the scene, the interview with the woman who has been sitting in the waiting room through all of this exists, if it exists at all, in the afterspace the legend does not occupy. The story ends at the closet door. This is, as a structural matter, a very specific choice. Not in the hospital, not in the police interview room, not in the conversation between the veterinarian and the woman in the waiting room when she is finally told what was found. The story ends at the point of maximum resolution, the intruder discovered, the loop closed, the danger that was invisible made visible and contained, and then it stops, because anything that comes after that point is resolution rather than story, and resolution tends to diminish rather than confirm the experience. Brunvan's notes, working their way through the 30 and 40 and 50 versions he had collected by the time the 1984 book was assembled, were building toward a picture of a story that knows what it is doing. Not consciously, no single teller designed the legend, but collectively, through the process of transmission, in which versions that worked kept working, and versions that added unnecessary complications fell away. What survived was a story with very clean narrative bones, a domestic space, an animal's distress, a medical setting, a discovery, a phone call, an official response, a hidden threat made visible. The gaps in the logical scaffolding were not surviving despite the story's transmission. They were surviving because the story didn't need to fill them to achieve what it was trying to achieve. On the legal pad, in the margin beside the question of why the intruder stayed, the word has been written and circled and perhaps underlined. It is not an accusation. It is a scholarly notation of a place where the story has gone quiet. The question sits there in the margin, the way unanswered questions tend to sit, not loudly, not urgently, but with a kind of patient permanence. The story continues to circulate. The question continues to be asked. The gap between them remains exactly as wide as it was when the story first reached Brunvan's desk, in a handwritten letter from a reader who had heard it from someone who lived in a neighborhood that sounded familiar and whose friend of a friend had been apparently there. The waiting room at the veterinary clinic has emptied out by now, in whatever imagined version of this scenario the listener is carrying. The woman has presumably been spoken to. The dog has been treated. The particular stillness of the space that surrounded her while she waited, coat still on, hands in her lap, The television doing whatever the television was doing has dissolved, but the image of that stillness stays in the legend, stays in all the versions of it, because it is the image at the story's center. Not the dog, not the fingers, not the intruder in the closet. The woman in the waiting room, held at the edge of a resolution she has not yet been given, surrounded by the ordinary objects of an ordinary medical waiting space. While somewhere in the middle distance of her evening, two separate trajectories, a police response and a veterinary finding, move toward each other and close. What Brunvin circled and underlined, in the end, was not just a logical gap. It was a place where the story had chosen silence over accountability, and in doing so had revealed something about what kind of story it was and what kind of work it was built to do. That work had nothing to do with veterinary accuracy or forensic procedure. It had to do with something older and simpler, which the story had learned to do very efficiently over the years of its transmission, changing its names and its streets and its finger counts, but keeping the structure intact. The logical gap sits in the margin. The story keeps moving. In the German state of Thuringia, in the 1880s, the town of Apolda was a place of modest streets and practical concerns. It was known for its bell foundry and its wool trade, neither of them industries that required particular imagination, and the people who lived there moved through their days with the specific purposeful quiet of a working town that has no reason to call attention to itself. One man who walked those streets regularly, moving between the homes of people who owed money and the civic offices where records were kept, was a tax collector named Carl Friedrich Louis Doberman. He also kept the local dog pound. That double occupation was more consequential than it sounds. A tax collector in a provincial German town in the latter half of the 19th century was not a popular figure, and the roads he traveled were not always hospitable. What Doberman needed, setting out on his rounds, was a dog that could function as both companion and deterrent, alert enough to register a threat before it materialized, physically capable enough to be taken seriously, and steady enough in temperament to work alongside a man in proximity to strangers for hours at a stretch. He had, as pound keeper, access to a wide variety of animals. He began with the quiet persistence of someone solving a practical problem to work out what combination might produce the dog he needed. The exact composition of that early breeding work has never been fully settled. What the historical record supports is that Rottweilers contributed substantially to the foundation, alongside German pinschers and black and tan terriers, and that Greyhound and Weimaraner blood was very likely introduced at some point, though which specific crosses were made in which order is not documented with any precision. Doberman was not keeping formal stud books for posterity. He was trying to produce a dog that would work, and he evaluated each generation against that practical standard, not against a written description of ideal proportions or a breed type that had been agreed upon by a committee. The dog that emerged from those decades of crossing was recognizable in broad outline, but not yet formalized, still being decided by accumulated observation and quiet correction with each new litter. Carl Friedrich Louis Doberman died in 1894, before the breed he had been assembling was fully stabilized or given a consistent name. The work of bringing it to a codified form was taken up by a breeder in the same town, Otto Goehler, who spent the years following Doberman's death evaluating, selecting, and refining the type that Doberman had established in practice. Goehler's contribution was the imposition of consistency, deciding what the dog should look like when it was done, and then breeding deliberately toward that image, rather than simply toward the general quality of usefulness. In 1900, the German Kennel Club formally recognized the Doberman Pinscher as a breed, the acknowledgement arriving 6 years after the man who had started the whole enterprise was no longer alive to see it. The dog that received that recognition was already close in appearance and temperament to the animal a person today would recognize from a distance, compact and muscular, with a short coat and a posture that suggested readiness without aggression. It carried in its bearing the accumulated purpose of its making, a working dog designed for a specific kind of alertness in a specific kind of circumstance, developed not in a large kennel operation run for prestige, but in the practical conditions of a working man's daily rounds through a German provincial town. What happened to that breed's reputation in the following decades is a more complicated story, and not one entirely of the dog's making. By the early decades of the 20th century, the Doberman had spread considerably beyond Thuringia, and the qualities that made it useful in a polda, its alertness, its physical capability, its willingness to act on its owner's behalf, made it attractive to police forces, military organizations, and security operations across Europe, and eventually the Americas. The First World War brought several European breeds into military and patrol service. The Second World War gave the Doberman a specific chapter of American military history that shaped in lasting ways how the breed would be perceived by a generation of people who had no direct contact with it. The United States Marine Corps, during the Pacific Island campaigns of World War II, deployed Dobermans in a unit that became informally known as the Devil Dogs. The name was borrowed from an older piece of American military slang and applied to these animals with the specific satisfaction of a label that captured two things at once: the Marines who worked with them and the dogs themselves. They served as sentries along the perimeters of camps in conditions that made human alertness alone insufficient. They carried messages across terrain where a human runner would have been too visible and too slow. They moved ahead of search operations into spaces that could not be safely entered first on two legs, and their presence on those island perimeters at night gave the men stationed there a kind of sensory extension that was genuinely useful, not ceremonial. Those dogs came home, or their successors did, and the stories that came home with them entered American popular consciousness, not as accounts of trained working animals performing specific tasks under careful supervision, but as evidence of a general quality, a capacity for ferocity, a willingness to act, a usable danger. This was not the whole picture of the breed, but it was the picture that got told most often because it was the most dramatic one. By the time the 1960s and 1970s arrived, with their shifts in suburban geography and their changing anxieties about safety and property, the Doberman had acquired the full cultural weight of a guard dog, not just an animal that could guard, but an animal that symbolized guarding, that stood in the cultural imagination for the protection of the home against unnamed threats. What gets lost in that symbolic accumulation is the actual dog, the real physical animal, measured and observed rather than imagined, is somewhat different from the creature the cultural image requires. A Doberman's bite force has been recorded at approximately 228 to 305 pounds per square inch, depending on the measuring method and the individual animal. That figure places the breed solidly in the upper middle range for domestic dogs, meaningfully stronger than the average, but below the force produced by Rottweilers, Mastiffs, and several other large breeds. The number is real, and it is not negligible. A bite from a Doberman is a significant physical event. What the number does not suggest, on its own, is the specific mechanical sequence the choking Doberman legend requires. A clean, complete, rapid severance of a human finger or fingers, the result arriving in the throat as a discrete object rather than a torn and partial one. Complete amputation of a finger requires a combination of conditions working together. The angle of the jaw at the moment of contact matters considerably. Whether the bite is a single focused pressure or a series of applied forces matters. Whether the target is resisting and moving matters. Whether the tissue has been compromised beforehand matters. A dog bite, even a severe one from a large animal, typically produces crushing and lacerating injury rather than clean transection. The distinction between those outcomes is not merely clinical, it has direct bearing on what kind of object would or would not be found in a dog's throat following a genuine confrontation of the kind the legend describes. This is not a claim that what the legend describes is impossible. It is simply a recognition that the legend presents the outcome as straightforward, when the actual biomechanics are considerably more particular. This point settles more comfortably alongside what behavioral research says about how a Doberman would actually behave in the scenario the legend constructs. A dog responding to a genuine intruder does not typically move directly to physical engagement. The behavioral pattern documented in working and guard dog research describes a hierarchy of responses that proceeds from threat detection through signaling before arriving at contact, and in most cases, contact itself is either deterrent, a single warning bite, or not reached at all. A dog that detects an unfamiliar presence in its home, or a presence it reads as threatening, will typically bark. The barking serves multiple purposes simultaneously. It alerts the owner, signals the intruder, and allows the dog to assess the response. A dog that has successfully repelled a threat, that has driven an intruder from an accessible space, or bitten and caused a retreat, will typically remain in a state of sustained arousal for a significant period afterward. What the choking Doberman legend presents is an animal that has apparently engaged in a serious physical confrontation with an intruder, inflicted what would be, for a human being, an extremely serious wound, and then settled into a state of quiet distress that its owner describes, arriving home, as choking, not as the agitated, alert, patrol-ready behavior of an animal that has recently defended its territory. The behavioral gap is quiet but real. A dog that has just done what the legend says this dog did would not be behaving in the way the legend says it was behaving. That inconsistency sits in the story without announcing itself, and most listeners move past it without pausing, because the narrative momentum carries them forward before the detail has time to register. To understand why that detail passes unnoticed, it helps to understand what the Doberman's reputation actually is, and how completely that reputation did its work on the legend's audience. By 1981, the year the choking Doberman began circulating in California and Arizona, and across several Midwestern states, the Doberman had been carrying the full weight of its guard dog reputation for at least 2 decades. It had appeared in films and on television as the embodiment of trained domestic menace. It had been used by police and security operations in ways that its training had prepared it for, but that its public image presented as innate. It occupied a specific cultural position, the large, dark, controlled, ferocious animal whose presence signified a boundary not to be crossed. This was the dog the legend chose, and it was not an arbitrary choice. A Labrador would not have served the story's needs. A Border Collie would not have served them. The legend needed an animal whose mere presence on a page or in a conversation carried the immediate weight of potential violence, so that the story did not have to do the work of establishing that weight itself. The Doberman did that work for free. This is the mechanism by which a breed's reputation and a story's needs converge. The legend did not create the Doberman's cultural image, It borrowed the image wholesale and used it as structural material, in the same way that a builder uses a wall that already exists rather than constructing a new one. The dog's reputation arrived in the listener's mind before the story did, and the story slid into the space that reputation had already cleared. The real Doberman, walking through a temperament assessment at a kennel club or a breed evaluation facility in the present day, produces data that complicates the cultural image without erasing it entirely. The American Temperament Test Society has assessed Doberman pinschers over the course of many years, and the breed's passing rate in the most recently available figures sits at approximately 79%, a figure that compares reasonably well to the general domestic dog population and places the Doberman solidly in the range of breeds assessed as reliably stable under standardized social stress. The test involves a sequence of controlled exposures, neutral interactions, sudden sounds, an unfamiliar approach, a simulated threatening approach, and a series of encounters designed to probe reactivity, aggression, and recovery. A dog that passes is one that demonstrates the ability to distinguish between a genuine threat and a neutral stimulus, that recovers from a startling event without sustained agitation, and that does not escalate to aggression in the absence of a legitimate trigger. The Doberman that sits at 79% is an animal that, in the overwhelming majority of cases, moves through those assessments with the specific combination of alertness and restraint that its original breeding was designed to produce. It is watchful. It is capable of action. It does not, in most cases, act without cause. The 21% that does not pass presents a more varied picture. Some of those failures reflect animals with specific anxiety profiles. Some reflect training histories that have produced reactivity. Some reflect the natural variation in any population of living creatures. A breed is not a guarantee. Each dog is also an individual, shaped by its own history of experience, its specific genetic inheritance, and the particular conditions of its life. The temperament test figure is a population-level finding. What it describes is the central tendency of the breed under assessment conditions, not a promise about any particular animal. What the figure does not describe is the guard dog of the cultural imagination, poised at the edge of unprovoked aggression, capable of sudden and complete violence at any moment without instigation. That dog exists as an image, sustained by decades of film and reputation, and the specific requirements of stories like the choking Doberman legend. The actual dog, the one that moves through the temperament assessment with watchful composure, is doing something quieter and more particular. It is being itself, which is a rather different thing than being a symbol. Carl Friedrich Louis Doberman, walking those Thuringian streets in the 1880s with an early version of the breed at his side, would not have recognized the symbolic weight the animal would carry a century later. What he had made was a working dog. The cobblestones were real. The routes between one household and the next were specific, known, daily. The dog moving beside him was an answer to a practical question. How does a man who carries records and collects money move safely through a world that does not always want him there? And the answer was a medium-sized animal of mixed ancestry, alert to its surroundings, willing to stay close, and capable of giving someone pause if the situation required it. That dog became many things in the years that followed. It became a military asset and a police tool. It became a cultural emblem and a narrative device. It became the animal whose name gives the legend its title, whose reputation does the story's essential work, whose choking state sets in motion everything that follows. The distance between Doberman's cobblestone rounds and a suburban California kitchen in 1981, with a telephone ringing and a neighbor's voice describing what happened to someone they know, is approximately a century. That century did a great deal to the breed's meaning in the human imagination, and relatively little to the breed itself. The dog that arrived in the legend was already perfect for its role before the first version was told. It was dark and sleek and associated with controlled violence. It lived in a comfortable suburban home, coded as safe. Its distress was the first signal that something had gone wrong in a world that was supposed to be orderly. It was both endangered and heroic, a victim and a defender, an animal whose suffering was the key that unlocked a hidden danger. No other breed carried all of those requirements in the same concentrated form. No other breed had the same combination of suburban familiarity and cultural menace, the same ability to be at once a household pet and a creature of genuine physical consequence. And yet the real breed, behind all of that accumulated weight, was developed in a town of modest streets by a man who needed a reliable companion on his daily rounds. The origin is practical, almost mundane, and it sits at some distance from the dramatic image the legend requires. The cobblestone street in Apolda, the tax collector moving from door to door, the dog at his side. These are quiet beginnings for an animal that would eventually find its way into one of the most widely circulated American urban legends of the 20th century. Otto Goehler, taking over the work of formalization after Doberman's death, was performing an act of definition, deciding through patient evaluation and selective breeding exactly what this animal was and what it should consistently be. The German Kennel Club's recognition in 1900 was the formal arrival of that definition, the moment when the breed moved from being a type of dog a particular man in a particular town was developing for his own purposes into a recognized category, with a name and a standard that could be reproduced, distributed, and known by people who had never seen a polda and would never think of it. That movement from local practice to recognized category is how breeds work, and how their reputations are made and circulated. A dog that was bred for a tax collector's rounds becomes, through military service and police deployment and film appearances and decades of accumulated cultural association, a dog that means something to people who have never met one. The meaning travels faster and further than the actual animal. It arrives in a listener's mind before the story does, and the story uses it. The World War II chapter in the breed's American history is the most concentrated moment of that reputation building. A unit of dogs working under genuine operational conditions in a genuine war, performing real tasks alongside real people, produced real outcomes that were documented and reported. Those dogs and those outcomes would enter the post-war American imagination not through careful analysis of the breed's actual temperament profile, but through the compressed language of military valor. Devil dogs, dark-coated and alert at the perimeter, extensions of the Marine's own intensity and purpose. The breed absorbed that association and carried it forward into peacetime, into suburban neighborhoods, into the guard dog industry, into the cultural landscape of the 1970s and 1980s, where the choking Doberman legend was waiting to be told. There is something worth sitting with in the gap between a dog assessed at 79% stable in a temperament test and a dog that has spent 40 years anchoring a story about hidden intruders and severed fingers. The assessment figure describes an animal that is mostly, reliably, calmly itself, watchful, alert, capable, and in the vast majority of cases, restrained in the application of those capabilities. The legend's version of the breed requires something quite different, an animal that acts without warning, whose violence is silent and total, whose after effects require veterinary intervention and police investigation. Both of those figures point toward the same species, the same breed, the same characteristic physical form, with the short coat and the compact muscular body and the ears that turn toward a sound before the rest of the animal has moved. What the gap between those two images measures is not the dog's true nature, which is already complicated enough, but the work that human imagination has done on the raw material of an actual animal. That work is substantial. It happens over decades, through film and newspaper and story, and the telephone conversations of suburban networks, through military history and guard dog marketing, and the specific requirements of a narrative that needs a particular kind of animal to do a particular kind of work. The dog does not choose any of this. It continues in the meantime to be what it was made to be, an alert, capable, reasonably stable, working animal whose origins lie in the practical daily rounds of a German tax collector in a town that most people in California or Arizona in 1981 had never heard of and would not have been able to find on a map. The legend chose the Doberman because the Doberman's reputation had already done the work of making it plausible. That plausibility was not a property of the actual animal. It was a property of the accumulated image, the decades of association, the military stories, the guard dog cultural position, the specific way the breed's appearance reads in the human nervous system as a signal of potential danger. The image functions independently of the dog. It exists in the minds of people who have never stood near a Doberman, never watched one move across a room, never seen one assessed in a temperament test, and found to be mostly, reliably, calmly, itself. A temperament test result is a number on a page. It sits in a file somewhere, in the records of a breed club or a kennel association, describing what happened when a specific animal moved through a standardized assessment, the sounds it tolerated, the approaches it weathered, the distinctions it drew between threatening and neutral stimuli, the recovery time after a startling event. The number does not capture everything the dog is. No number does, but it captures something that the legend cannot accommodate, the specific quiet competence of an animal whose capabilities are real, whose temperament has been shaped by more than a century of careful selection, and whose ordinary daily existence is considerably more composed than the story requires. The 79% sits quietly in the record. It does not announce itself. It does not correct the legend's version of the breed in any dramatic way. It simply describes, calmly and specifically, what happened when the dogs were assessed, and what happened most of the time was that the dog passed, that the dog moved through each stage of the assessment with the watchful, grounded composure of an animal that knows the difference between a real threat and an unfamiliar one, that can be startled without being unmoored, that holds its alertness alongside a genuine capacity for stillness. The breed that Carl Friedrich Louis Doberman assembled in Apolda in the 1880s on cobblestone streets between one household and the next was designed to walk alongside a man doing an unpopular job in an environment that was occasionally hostile. It was designed to be present and capable and steady, not simply ferocious, not simply a weapon, but a companion whose qualities made the world a little safer for the person it accompanied. That original design is still visible in the assessment figures, in the behavioral research, in the measured bite force numbers that place the breed in the upper middle range rather than at the extreme. The dog is capable of considerable things, and it is also most of the time composed. The legend needed the ferocity without the composure. It took the capability and left the steadiness behind, because steadiness does not serve the story's needs in the way that sudden, silent, total violence does. This is not a criticism of the legend. It is simply a description of how stories use their materials. A narrative selects from what is available. It takes the parts that serve its structure and leaves the parts that complicate it. The Doberman's reputation offered ferocity readily. The actual breed's temperament offered something more nuanced, and nuance is not a useful building material for a story that needs a clean inciting event. The dog at the center of the legend is not really a Doberman. It is a shape that resembles a Doberman, carrying the breed's cultural weight without any of its specific physical or behavioral reality. It is the idea of a Doberman, dark, capable, sudden, total, performing narrative work in a story about suburban vulnerability and hidden danger. The real breed persists behind that idea, assessed and measured and moving calmly through temperament evaluations in facilities where the outcome is recorded rather than imagined. A number on a page, 79%, the result of an assessment carried out under controlled conditions, with trained evaluators watching specific behaviors and recording specific outcomes, in a facility that has nothing to do with suburban California in 1981 or Thuringian cobblestones in the 1880s. It is simply the measured fact of what the breed is when it is allowed to be itself rather than required to be a symbol. And the symbol, the dark animal at the center of the legend, will continue to carry the story's weight forward through each new retelling, each new version told at a dinner table or typed into a message thread. The dog in the story will continue to choke, the fingers will continue to be found, the intruder will continue to be discovered in the closet. None of that has anything to do with the actual breed, which continues indifferently and calmly to exist. Somewhere in a quiet house in the late afternoon, a Doberman is moving through its ordinary day. Its ears turn briefly toward a sound from outside. Its sides rise and fall at the steady pace of an animal at rest. The 79% result sits in a file. Carl Friedrich Louis Doberman walked his rounds a century and a half ago with a dog whose descendants would eventually become one of the most symbolically loaded animals in American folklore, in a town whose name none of the people who told the legend had any reason to know. The assessment result is a fact, plain and specific, and it describes something that the legend does not, a breed that was made for steadiness as much as capability, that passes its tests more often than it fails them, and that continues, in the quiet afternoon of any given day, to be considerably more composed than the story requires. An adult human index finger, measured from the base knuckle to the tip, is somewhere between 3 and 4 inches long. Its diameter at the widest point runs roughly 3/4 of an inch, occasionally a little more, occasionally a little less, depending on the individual. The bones inside, 3 of them in the finger itself, the proximal, middle, and distal phalanges, are dense, cortical, and relatively rigid, the kind of material that resists compression and holds its shape under considerable force. These are not remarkable facts on their own. They are the ordinary dimensions of an ordinary part of the human body. What makes them worth considering carefully in the context of the choking Doberman legend is that they are the first thing a veterinarian would actually need to know when presented with a large dog in respiratory distress, because before any question of where a foreign object came from, there is the prior question of whether a foreign object of any given size could do what the legend says it did in the anatomical space where the legend says it was found. The pharynx of a large domestic dog is not a small space in a Doberman of standard adult weight, somewhere between 60 and 90 pounds. The pharyngeal cavity, the region at the back of the throat, where the oral and nasal passages converge before the airway descends toward the trachea, is wide enough to accommodate a folded piece of tough material, a fragment of bone, or a densely packed wad of tissue without immediately producing the kind of obstruction that would send the animal into acute distress. The trachea below it in a dog of that size runs approximately an inch and a half in diameter. A single adult human finger, oriented lengthwise, would fit within that general range of dimensions. Oriented crosswise, or tumbling into the upper pharyngeal space and lodging at an angle, the same finger could plausibly reduce the effective airway diameter enough to produce the labored, noisy breathing that the legend describes. The geometry is not impossible. This is, in fact, one of the places where the story's scenario has something like a credible foundation, because the inciting event, a large dog showing signs of airway compromise, maps reasonably well onto what the documented dimensions of both the dog's anatomy and the proposed foreign body would actually produce. What the legend describes as the dog's presentation, pawing at its throat, gagging repeatedly, lying collapsed on the kitchen floor with its breathing clearly wrong, is also, in clinical terms, recognizable. A dog experiencing partial airway obstruction from a lodged foreign body behaves in specific, consistent ways, and the behaviors the legend sketches match what veterinary emergency literature documents. The animal typically extends its neck, an instinctive attempt to straighten the airway and create more room. It paws repeatedly at its own muzzle, trying to remove what it cannot reach. Its breathing produces an audible stridor, a rough, high sound made by air moving through a constricted passage, not the ordinary sound of a panting dog, but something distinctly wrong, the kind of sound a dog owner would identify immediately as different. In severe cases, the gums and tongue begin to shift color, moving from pink toward a dusky gray or blue as oxygen delivery falls. This last detail is not one the legend includes, but its absence is not surprising. The versions that circulated were not clinical documents. They were stories shaped for transmission, and the details most likely to survive that shaping were the ones that could be quickly understood by a listener who has seen a dog in distress, not the ones that required a knowledge of mucosal coloration under hypoxic conditions. The emotional legibility of that opening scene, the owner walking into her home, finding the dog collapsed and clearly struggling, is the element that has always given the legend its most solid foothold in the listener's sense of plausibility. It is where the story asks the least of its audience. Dogs do choke. Large dogs are capable of swallowing objects that lodge in their upper airways. Emergency veterinary visits for exactly this kind of presentation happen every day across every city, where people keep animals, and the specific texture of that scenario, the ordinary domestic room, the animal that should have come to greet you at the door, the sudden wrongness of a familiar creature in an unfamiliar posture is the kind of image that requires no suspension of disbelief, because most people who have kept a dog have at some point felt the specific alarm of an animal that seemed unwell in a way they could not immediately name. A veterinary emergency clinic in the early 1980s would have received this kind of presentation with a fairly standardized sequence of steps, and those steps are worth moving through carefully because they are where the legend's scenario begins to complicate itself. The first priority in any presentation involving suspected airway obstruction in a dog is rapid assessment, heart rate, respiratory rate, oxygen saturation, if the equipment is available, a visual evaluation of the mucous membranes. If the animal is stable enough to tolerate it, a physical examination of the oral cavity follows, which in a dog the size of a Doberman requires either the animal's cooperation or a mild sedative, since a dog in distress and receiving a painful intervention will resist. Under even minimal sedation, the oral cavity of a large dog is accessible enough for a clinician to visualize the pharyngeal space with a light source, and in many cases of foreign body obstruction, the object can be identified and sometimes retrieved at this stage. If the obstruction is not immediately visible on oral examination, if it has moved into the upper esophagus or settled into a position where direct visualization is not possible, the next step is radiographic imaging. Human phalangeal bone, the dense cortical bone of a finger, is radio-opaque. It appears on a standard X-ray as a bright white shape against the softer gray of surrounding tissue, the same way any dense mineralized structure would appear. The outline of a finger bone is recognizable to a trained radiologist or an experienced veterinary clinician. It does not look like a chicken bone or a fragment of rawhide or a smooth river pebble. It looks like what it is. In a small hospital or a moderately equipped veterinary practice of the early 1980s, taking and reading a lateral thoracic or cervical radiograph was a routine procedure, not an elaborate undertaking, and the result would have been interpretable in the time it took the film to develop. This is where the legend scenario produces its first significant strain. The story requires that the veterinarian discover the obstruction, identify its nature, human fingers, specifically, and respond by calling the police rather than the owner. That sequence implies that the clinical finding is unusual enough to trigger an immediate legal response, and in practice, a veterinary clinician recovering identifiable human tissue from a dog's airway would have no procedurally ambiguous path. The finding would require reporting that part of the legend's architecture is internally coherent. The strain is in the imaging step, because a radiograph taken before or during the procedure that resolved the obstruction would have shown, in clear and unambiguous terms, the shape of what was lodged in the animal's airway. It would not have been a mystery. It would not have been something discovered only upon surgical retrieval or during the procedure itself, producing the sudden revelation the legend requires for its dramatic turn. The discovery would have been a confirmation of what the image had already indicated, rather than a shock that arrives without warning. The distinction matters because the legend's emotional architecture depends on the finding being a surprise to the veterinarian, presumably, and certainly to the owner waiting in the front room without any knowledge of what is happening behind the closed door. Radiographic imaging, which is the standard diagnostic approach to foreign body obstruction in a dog of this size, forecloses that particular form of surprise. The clinician reviewing the film would have known before any retrieval procedure began that the object inside the dog was likely human in origin. The call to the police in a scenario where imaging had been performed would have been made on the basis of that reading before any physical recovery of the material, which means the timeline of events the legend describes, in which a telephone call to police is made following a discovery in the operating space, is probably not the sequence in which things would have actually unfolded. There is also the question of what the recovered material would have looked like, and what would have been required of it the moment it left the animal's body. A human finger, or portion thereof, retrieved from a dog's airway in the early 1980s would have been immediately subject to forensic handling protocols. The practical reality of mandatory reporting in veterinary medicine means that the moment a clinician believed they had recovered human tissue from an animal's airway, the material became potential evidence. Chain of custody procedures exist precisely for this moment: the labeled container, the documented time of recovery, the signature of the clinician who performed the retrieval, the separation of the material from clinical waste. In a scenario with a living intruder still in the owner's house, the chain of custody of that material would have been critical. It would not have been a passing revelation. It would have been the beginning of a very specific, very carefully documented evidentiary process. Soft tissue recovered from a dog's gastrointestinal or respiratory space retains identifiable characteristics through at least a single digestive or transit cycle. Skin surface patterns, including fingerprint ridge structure, are preserved for some time after severance from a living body. Nail tissue, keratinous and dense, resists enzymatic breakdown. In the early 1980s, blood typing from recovered tissue was a standard forensic tool available to most law enforcement agencies through their regional crime laboratories, and the blood type of a recovered finger fragment could be used to establish a connection between the tissue and a living individual, or to exclude such a connection. This is the kind of fact that the legend's scenario passes over in silence, not because it is implausible that fingers could leave recoverable evidence, but because the story was not built to sustain that level of procedural consequence. It was built to sustain a different kind of consequence: the discovery of the intruder hidden in the closet, the resolution of the threat, the narrative completion of the loop between dog doctor and law. The forensic veterinary literature, which is a relatively narrow field, contains documented cases from the decades after the legend first circulated, in which identifiable human bone and tissue were recovered from the gastrointestinal tracts of large domestic dogs during homicide investigations and mass disaster scenarios. These cases establish something important. Dogs are capable of consuming and retaining human material in a form that remains forensically useful. The question of whether a dog could bite through living human fingers and cause traumatic amputation is a separate and somewhat more complicated question, because it involves not just the dog's bite force, but the specific circumstances of the bite, the angle of the jaw, the resistance of the material, the number of repeated bites, and the degree to which the hand in question was or was not held still by the intruder during the encounter. The Doberman's bite force, measured across multiple studies, runs somewhere between roughly 230 and 300 pounds per square inch, depending on the individual animal and the specific study methodology. This places it in the upper middle range among domestic breeds. It is a significant force, more than sufficient to cause serious injury to human tissue and to fracture smaller bones under the right conditions. Complete traumatic amputation of a human finger, however, is not a simple function of available bite force. It requires a combination of factors: the shearing angle of the jaw at the moment of contact, the degree to which bone and soft tissue are compressed before the teeth reach their maximum penetration, and the physical resistance offered by the material being severed. Living bone in an adult is substantially tougher than cooked or dried bone of the same diameter, and the proximal phalanx of a human finger is not a fragile structure. What bite force studies measure is the peak pressure a jaw can generate over a small contact area, not the capacity for clean sectioning of a load-bearing biological structure. All of this means that the legend's central image, 1, 2, or 3 complete fingers found lodged in a dog's airway, is the most mechanically demanding element of the entire scenario. It requires not just that the dog bit an intruder, which is plausible, and not just that the bite caused serious injury, which is also plausible, but that the resulting injury produced amputated portions of sufficient integrity and size to travel separately from the intruder into the dog's airway and lodge there in a way that produced the observed clinical presentation. A dog that bites a human hand will cause significant tissue damage, but the resulting wounds are typically lacerations and crush injuries rather than clean amputations, and material from a bite wound tends to remain at the site of contact rather than traveling cleanly into the animal's oral cavity as a discrete object. The legend requires a specific chain of physical events, each one plausible in isolation, that becomes progressively less likely the more carefully each link is examined in sequence. The intruder's behavior after the event presents its own set of questions that the clinical and forensic picture makes more pointed. A person who has sustained a traumatic bite injury to the hand, particularly one severe enough to produce the kind of blood loss that would leave them incapacitated in a closet, would be in acute pain, producing a physiological stress response that typically includes elevated heart rate, heavy breathing, and involuntary vocalization. The idea that such a person remained concealed and silent in a small enclosed space for the hours between the initial encounter with the dog and the arrival of police is the element of the story that forensic and behavioral considerations press on most firmly, because the human response to that level of injury is not characterized by stillness and silence. It is characterized by the opposite. A search of published American law enforcement databases and criminal case records has not produced a verified instance that matches the legend's scenario with specificity. A burglar found incapacitated in a residential closet following traumatic injury inflicted by the homeowner's dog, with the dog subsequently treated at an emergency veterinary clinic for foreign body obstruction involving human tissue. This is the kind of event that would have generated a police report, a veterinary record, an insurance claim, and almost certainly a local newspaper notice. Because even in an era before social media, the story of a dog stopping a burglary by biting off a burglar's fingers was the kind of local news story that printed the documentation trail that a real version of this event would have left is the clearest measure of the gap between the legend's scenario and anything that has been found in the record. None of this means the clinical and forensic analysis lands somewhere simple. The scenario the legend describes is not impossible in every particular. Dogs do become ill from swallowed foreign material. Foreign body obstructions do present with the behavioral signs the legend describes. Veterinary radiography does identify human bone when it is present. Forensic protocols do preserve recovered material for evidentiary use. The individual components of the story's scenario each have some relationship to how the real world works, which is part of why the story survives as a story. The problem is not that each element is false. The problem is that the elements, assembled together in the specific sequence the legend requires, produce a chain of events that is progressively more demanding with each link, and the final picture, a clean, undeniable discovery, a dramatic telephone call, a living intruder waiting patiently in a closet, a neat resolution involving dog, doctor, and police, is a picture shaped by what makes a satisfying story, rather than by what the medical and forensic record of such events actually looks like. The real version, had it ever occurred, would have looked considerably less neat. The radiograph would have preceded the dramatic discovery. The chain of custody documentation would have begun before the telephone call. The intruder, if found alive, would not have been silent. The blood at the scene would have indicated, to an experienced investigator, a great deal more than a single concealed figure. The clinical notes would have been precise, and clinical precision is not the material from which oral legend is typically made, because precision forecloses the kind of imaginative participation that allows a story to be retold with different details in different cities without anyone noticing the seams. A veterinary radiograph from an emergency presentation in, say, 1983, the film pulled from the developing tank, held up against the light box, the dense white shapes reading against the gray of surrounding tissue, is about as far from the drama of oral legend as an image can be. It is a record. It answers questions. It establishes what is there, and by absence, what is not. The legend, in contrast, is structured around a moment when the finding is revealed rather than read, when it arrives rather than accumulates. And that structural difference is ultimately the clearest way to mark the distance between the story as it circulated and the world in which veterinary medicine actually operates. The posture of a choking dog is worth returning to before leaving the clinical territory entirely, because it is the detail that connects most directly to the physical world in which real dogs live. The extended neck, the repeated pawing at the muzzle, the audible change in breathing, these are things that a person who has kept a large dog may have encountered in some form, and their specificity gives the legend's opening scene a texture that almost no other element of the story provides. That specificity is real. That behavioral picture is accurately drawn. A Doberman in genuine respiratory distress from a lodged foreign body would look and sound very much the way the legend describes. This is worth noting, not because it makes the rest of the scenario more credible, but because it marks the precise point where the legend is doing what a good story does, beginning with something true, something felt, something that the listener can locate in their own experience or their own capacity to imagine, before asking them to follow a chain of events that leads somewhere the documentary record has never confirmed. The 1980s forensic laboratory, equipped with blood typing reagents and the standard tools of serological analysis, was a more limited instrument than the DNA profiling that would begin appearing in criminal casework within a few years of the legend's first circulation. But it was not a crude instrument. Blood type could be established from a relatively small sample of recovered tissue. The ABO system could exclude a suspect as well as include one. If a finger recovered from a dog's airway had been typed, the result would have been immediately usable, not definitive by modern standards, but usable, a piece of the evidentiary picture that could be held against the blood found at the scene and the blood of a suspect in custody. In the years after the mid-1980s, when restriction fragment length polymorphism analysis began to be applied to criminal casework for the first time, even a small fragment of tissue recovered from a dog's airway could in principle have yielded a DNA profile, given a sufficiently intact sample. The science was new and the processing times were long, but the window between the legend's first circulation and the arrival of DNA evidence in courtrooms is narrower than it might seem, and the implication is that had the legend's event occurred at any point across the decades of its circulation, the forensic tools available in that decade would have been applied to whatever was recovered. The evidence would not have disappeared. It would have been documented, preserved, analyzed, and attached to a case file that existed in the record somewhere. The reagent bottles in those early forensic laboratories, small, precisely labeled, arranged in a specific order on a shelf beside the light microscope and the electrophoresis apparatus, represent as a quiet image everything that a real version of the legend's central event would have immediately met. Not trauma, not revelation, a procedure, a careful, methodical, thoroughly documented procedure that would have left a trail in exactly the places where the trail, in the case of the choking Doberman, has never been found. The legend asks to be believed on the basis of its emotional coherence, the protective dog, the hidden danger, the discovery that arrives just in time to prevent something worse. The veterinary and forensic record asks something different. It asks for the radiograph, the chain of custody form, the blood typing result, the police incident report with a case number, the news item in the local paper. What it finds when it goes looking is the story, just the story. Fear that is too ambient, too shapeless, too socially awkward to discuss directly gets poured into a narrative and handed from person to person in a form that can be processed, shared, and momentarily resolved. The choking Doberman is nearly a clinical case study in this mechanism because the fears it contains are so legible from this distance that they read almost like an inventory of the early 1980s domestic imagination. There was the fear of the intruder, a stranger in the house, the private space violated. There was the fear that the neighborhood's apparent safety was a surface, that the calm street and the latched gate meant less than they appeared to mean. And threaded through both of those was a specific gendered anxiety. The woman alone at home, the assumption that solitude was a condition of exposure, the belief that safety required another presence, animal, medical, official, to guarantee it. The legend did not invent any of these fears. It simply organized them into a plot, with a beginning, a middle, and an end, which is more than most diffuse anxiety can manage on its own. Jan Harold Brunvand, who devoted considerable scholarly attention to exactly this kind of story, identified one of the most reliable mechanisms of urban legend transmission in a phrase he used almost as casually as one might use a compass bearing: the faux F, friend of a friend. The story didn't happen to the person telling it. It happened to someone they know, or to someone that person knows, which places the ultimate source precisely one step beyond the reach of any direct question. The attribution is specific enough to feel credible, not a general rumor, not something from the news, but a real person in a real neighborhood, and vague enough that it can never be followed all the way back. Brunvand documented this feature across dozens of variants of the choking Doberman story and found it remarkably consistent. The telling almost always included what he called a plausibility marker, a named street, a recognizable suburb, a mutual acquaintance whose name you might know. These details were rarely verifiable, and when pursued, they tended to dissolve. The street didn't quite match. The acquaintance didn't remember saying it. The original source had moved and couldn't be reached. But in the moment of telling, they did their work with considerable efficiency. They made the story feel local. They made it feel recent. They made it feel, above all, like something that had happened to a specific family in a specific house rather than something that was being passed from mind to mind in the dark. The faux F structure is not a sign that someone is lying. Most of the people who told the choking Doberman story believed it, or believed enough of it, that the distinction was difficult to locate. They had heard it from a real friend, who had heard it from a real person, who had heard it in genuine good faith from someone else. The sincerity runs all the way through the chain. What the chain lacks is not honesty, but an origin, a first source that can be examined, a first telling that happened in an accountable place with accountable witnesses. The story floats free of any such origin, which is precisely what allows it to attach to any neighborhood, any suburb, any woman with any dog on any quiet residential street. Dog-centered legends as a category travel with unusual persistence compared to legends built around other animals. Researchers who have mapped the spread and survival rates of different legend types have noted that the dog's particular cultural position, simultaneously familiar, trusted, protective, and physically capable of violence, makes it an almost uniquely effective legend vehicle. A story about a dog carries with it a weight of personal investment that a story about, say, a spider or a rat simply does not produce in most listeners. People have dogs. People have loved dogs. The specific alarm of a dog in distress is recognizable in a way that is almost involuntary, a pull that activates before any rational assessment takes place. The choking Doberman legend amplifies this by making the dog both victim and hero. The animal is in danger, which activates the listener's protectiveness. The animal caused that danger by defending its owner, which activates the listener's admiration. The animal's injury is the mechanism through which the threat is discovered, which makes the dog, in the story's moral architecture, not just a pet, but a kind of silent investigator, wounded in the line of duty, communicating the only way it can. Dog owners specifically bring to this story an emotional literacy that makes its central scenario feel immediately comprehensible. Of course, the dog fought. Of course, it didn't bark afterward, because it couldn't. The story asks its audience to do the work of imagining an animal's inner life, and the audience, particularly if they have ever owned a large dog, does that work willingly and well. This emotional investment is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is part of what makes the legend worth studying, rather than simply correcting. The Choking Doberman is not a story about stupidity. It is not a story that only credulous people believe. It circulated among ordinary, intelligent adults in full possession of their faculties, and it circulated because it addressed real feelings in a form that was emotionally coherent and narratively satisfying. The people in the folding chairs in Columbus, Ohio, were not being foolish. They were doing what human beings have always done with stories, using them to process what they could not quite process directly. The FBI's Uniform Crime Report statistics from that period document what those folding chair audiences already felt. The US Bening to Kimball, Titane Quenchley, the Dead's Verticam, with those folding chair audiences already felt. The US Bening Dislead of Times Repairgwijk, to the other times Repairgwijk, and during the Hunnies Resubbeltwi, for Ormes Ovrio Pastoring, little large period hero fashion, repairing Testalardio. Violent crime rate reached its recorded peak in 1980 and 1981 at levels that would not be seen again in the decades that followed. The media coverage of those numbers was extensive and in some markets approaching saturation. Home burglary in particular received sustained attention, and the specific scenario of an intruder in a home that appeared to be empty was a recurring motif in the crime reporting of those years. The neighborhood watch movement grew in direct response to this coverage, and with it grew a whole secondary industry of home security products, deadbolt upgrades, and motion-sensitive lighting, a physical, purchasable response to anxiety that had no single address. The Choking Doberman arrived into this environment like a story that had been written specifically for it, which of course it had, in the way that all folklore is written by the moment it inhabits. The story didn't need an author. It needed only the precise cultural conditions that would allow it to spread, and those conditions were present in almost every English-speaking suburb in the early 1980s. The locked door, the dog, the woman home alone, the stranger in the closet. These were not random elements. They were drawn directly from the surface of the era's collective unease, arranged into a plot, and sent out into the telephone networks and the church halls and the hairdressers' chairs to do the work that shapeless anxiety cannot do for itself. The spread was genuinely rapid. Before the internet existed as a transmission mechanism, the legend reached across the United States and into the United Kingdom, Australia, Canada, and South Africa within a few years of its earliest documented appearances. This kind of pre-digital spread required person-to-person contact, which is a slower mechanism than an algorithm, but not as slow as it might seem. A single compelling story told in a workplace, shared across a telephone network, repeated at a dinner party, and carried into a church hall can reach hundreds of people within a week, and each of those people carries the story to their own networks. The mathematics of word of mouth, when the story is sufficiently compelling, are not so different from the mathematics of a digital feed. The Choking Doberman also belonged, in its own time, to a clearly identifiable legend family that Brunvand and subsequent folklorists had been mapping with some care. It sits within the broad category that researchers call contamination and discovery legends, stories in which someone finds, inside a familiar object or a trusted creature, something that should not be there. The spider in the yucca plant, the snake in the department store carpet, the dog that had consumed something monstrous. What makes the choking Doberman notable within this family is that the discovery is not the end. In most contamination legends, finding the spider or the snake or the unexpected thing is the climax and the close. The story offers the jolt of wrongness and then stops. The choking Doberman does something structurally more layered than that. The discovery of the fingers, which in the story's architecture functions as the first revelation, immediately generates a second and more unsettling one. The intruder is still there. The veterinarian's call to police doesn't close the story. It opens a new sequence, and what the officers find in the closet or beneath the bed is not evidence of a danger that is past, but a danger that is still present, still breathing, still in the house. This double reveal structure, in which the first grotesque discovery turns out to be a signal pointing toward a second, more immediate threat, is relatively rare in the contamination legend family, and it gives the choking Doberman a narrative momentum that simpler versions of the same kind of story cannot match. It is this structure, more than any single element of the story, that kept it circulating so vigorously. A single reveal contamination tale produces one emotional beat, the wrongness of the found thing, the contamination of the familiar. The choking Doberman produces two, and the second is larger than the first. The fingers are grotesque. The intruder in the closet is immediate. The story keeps moving when comparable stories have already arrived at their conclusion, and the result is a legend that audiences find it very difficult to leave behind when the telling ends. It has done more work than they expected. It has left more to think about. It sits with them in the way that good narrative architecture always sits with you, not because you are frightened exactly, but because the structure has done something to the way the room feels. It is worth pausing here to look at what that structural sophistication actually represents, because the choking Doberman is not, in any strict sense, a new kind of story. The legend family it belongs to has very old roots. Protective animal tales, stories in which an animal companion warns its owner of unseen danger, often at cost to itself, appear in world folklore across cultures and centuries. The loyal hound who drives away a wolf and is then killed by its master before the master understands what the dog had done. The cat who scratches its owner awake before a fire reaches the bedroom. The horse who refuses to cross a bridge before the weight of a hidden flood tests it. These stories share a fundamental shape with the choking Doberman. An animal sustains harm in the course of protecting its human, and the harm is the message that makes the protection legible. What the choking Doberman does with this ancient material is characteristically modern. It moves the protective animal into a specific, named, contemporary setting. It introduces the apparatus of modern institutions, veterinary medicine, police forensics, emergency response, as the mechanism through which the animal's message is decoded. It encodes the specific anxieties of its own historical moment, and the role of the protected person and the nature of the threat. The shape of the story is centuries old. The clothing is entirely 1981. This is how folklore tends to work across time. The old narrative containers fill with new contents. The fears change. The institutions change. The breed of dog changes from the loyal hound of a medieval fable to the Doberman pinscher of a California suburb. But the fundamental relationship between the animal and the human, the sacrifice and the warning, the harm is message. That shape persists because it corresponds to something in the way people think about the creatures that share their lives, something that doesn't change much across generations, something that the choking Doberman's tellers and listeners recognized without needing to be told. By 1984, when Brunvan collected his most extensive documentation of the legend, it had already been absorbed into the broader conversation about what urban legends are and why they matter. Brunvan's book gave it a title, placed it in academic context, and made it available for the kind of examination that the story's original tellers had never imagined. What had been told across telephone lines and hairdressers' chairs and church hall meetings was now in a library. Students read it. Researchers cited it. It appeared on course syllabuses beside other legends of its period, formally recognized as a document of its era, its place in the record, quietly confirmed. But the academic recognition did not stop the oral transmission. The story kept circulating after Brunvan wrote about it, after researchers documented its logical gaps, after it became a recognized and identified piece of American folklore. It appeared in news groups in the early internet period. It appeared in forum posts in the late 1990s. In 2019, a comment on a popular online platform included a completely sincere account of the story, posted by someone who had heard it from a coworker who had said it happened to a friend. The faux structure was intact. The essential plot was intact. The essential plot was intact. The plausibility markers had been updated to fit a current neighborhood and a current suburb, but the story was the same story, traveling by the same mechanism, doing the same work. This persistence is not a failure of education or a sign that the internet makes people credulous. It is evidence that the story continues to find cultural conditions that welcome it, listeners whose anxieties it addresses, tellers whose need to share a cautionary account is satisfied by its particular shape. Stories that perform genuine psychological and social work don't stop circulating because someone demonstrates that they are not factually accurate. They circulate as long as the work they perform is needed, and the work the choking Doberman performs, making a diffuse domestic anxiety coherent and giving it a resolution, is the kind of work that most periods, in most places, find a use for. There is something almost restful in that, when the alarm of it is set aside. The legend is not evidence that the world is more dangerous than it seems, or that people are more frightened than they let on, or that trust in a neighborhood's safety is a thin surface over something worse. It is evidence that people have always used stories to organize what they feel, and that the stories they choose tend to be the ones that fit the feeling most precisely. The choking Doberman fit the feeling of the early 1980s almost perfectly. It has continued to fit the feelings of the decades since, which is its own kind of testimony, not to the reality of intruders in closets or fingers in dogs' throats, but to the enduring human preference for a fear that has a shape and an ending. Brunvan's own approach to these stories was in its way the most useful model for how to receive them. He collected them with affection. He examined them with care. He noted their gaps and their implausibilities without contempt for the people who had told them and believed them. He understood that the distance between a false story and a true one was not the distance between foolishness and intelligence, but the distance between different kinds of need, the need for a fact and the need for a meaning, which are not always the same need and do not always run toward the same answer. The choking Doberman has no verified instance. No police report matches it. No veterinary record supports it. No newspaper account in the 40-plus years since the story began circulating has confirmed a case that stands up to the kind of examination a real incident would require. What it has instead is hundreds of sincere tellers, thousands of attentive listeners, a place in a scholarly bibliography, and a longevity that most verified news stories from the same period cannot claim. It is, in the end, more durable than many true things. The story's persistence across all this time and across all the different mouths and rooms and telephone lines and comment sections that have carried it is itself a kind of fact, not about intruders or dogs or veterinarians, but about the particular human need that a story like this one addresses. That need is not going anywhere. It shows up wherever there is a neighborhood that feels slightly less certain than it did wherever there is a person in a house at night running through a quick mental list of the things that could go wrong. Wherever there is a diffuse unease looking for a container with a beginning, a middle, and an end. A man named Michael in Portland in 2022 posted the story to a neighborhood forum under the header, "Wanted to share, stay safe out there," because his neighbor had told him it had happened to a woman in the next suburb over, and he thought his neighbors should know. He had never heard of Bryn Van. He had no idea the story had a name. He simply had a story that a person he trusted had told him, and a community of neighbors he wanted to warn. And the story seemed to fit the warning exactly. 40 years earlier, a woman in a Columbus, Ohio church hall had said the same thing for the same reason, in slightly different words, to 43 people in folding chairs. The story had traveled a long way between those two moments, but its essential work had not changed at all. This is the thing about folklore that all the debunking in the world does not quite touch. Correcting the factual record of a legend is a useful and honest act, but it does not reach the level at which the legend operates, which is not the level of facts at all. The choking Doberman does not ask to be believed the way a newspaper report asks to be believed. It asks to be felt. It asks for the specific recognition of a fear that the listener already carries, the vulnerability of the home, the uncertain threshold between the safe and the unsafe, and it offers for a moment a plot that makes that fear manageable. The veterinarian finds something, the police come. The dog, in the end, was doing what it was supposed to do, and the thing that seemed like an ordinary evening turned out to have been something else all along. But it turned out all right. There is a version of that ending that is genuinely comforting, even if the story that delivers it is invented. And the comfort is not a lie. Exactly. It is a narrative negotiation with an anxiety that is real. The story says, the dog will know. The story says, there are people with the right instruments and the right training who will find what needs to be found. The story says, even when the threat is invisible and the evening is ordinary, something is watching. Whether or not any of that is true in any specific house on any specific evening, it is a story that people find worth telling. And they have been finding it worth telling for more than 40 years now, across oceans and time zones and technological eras, through every kind of room and every kind of medium, which is its own unusual kind of fact about what human beings need from the stories they keep. Outside the church hall in Columbus in the autumn of 1981, the neighborhood was quiet. The streets ran under amber lights between houses with dark windows. The lawns were close cut, and the cars were in their driveways, and the dogs were inside, behind the doors, in the warm interiors of houses that most of their inhabitants were quite certain were safe. The folding chairs were still occupied. The coffee urn was still producing its low sound. The police officer had moved on to the subject of exterior lighting, and the handout was being passed along the rows. The story about the dog was not in the handout. It was in the room anyway. present in the way that a shared piece of knowledge is present when the people who hold it are gathered together, not spoken at that moment, but available, ready to be told again on the right occasion to the right listener, which was every occasion and every listener who already carried the feeling the story was built to address.